There she is. Oh, can't hear you.
That's better.
There we go.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Good, how are you?
It's early down there, right? In Australia?
Yes, it is 6:37 a.m.
Our delay worked in your favor, so that's good.
It did. I still set my alarm early though.
Right? Not more sleep, but a little more coffee in you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm gonna let you take it away.
All right, I will share my screen. All
Yep,
right,
we
can you
see
see
it.
that?
Yep.
Excellent. All right. Hi everyone. My name is Jess Archer and I'm a full stack developer from Brisbane, Australia. I gave a talk by the same name at Laracon AU last year, but there was so much I couldn't fit and so much I've learnt since, so this is all new content. You don't need to have seen the first talk, but if you like this one, then make sure to find the first one on YouTube. And much of this will apply to front-end code in general, so don't tune out just because you don't use Vue. I hope to have something for everyone, but if I go over something you're already doing, then hopefully it's still fun to have someone tell you how much they like it. And because of the time limit, I'm going to have to assume you already know a bit about reactive component-based frameworks like Vue. But even if you don't, you probably still work with people that do. And I strongly believe that everyone is far more effective at their own role when they have some perspective of the roles adjacent to theirs. To quickly illustrate this, I made this little stack diagram. It won't represent every stack, and I'm sorry if I've missed anything important. I'm assuming most of us are strongest in this front-end and back-end area, even the full stack devs. However, generally be working closely with the roles either side of us, and even beyond that. I think back-end devs are better at their jobs when they understand the challenges and concerns of both front-end development and server management. Likewise, I think that front-end devs are better when they understand the challenges and concerns of both back-end development and UI design. And I'm sure many of us have worked with designers that don't understand the challenges and concerns of implementing certain designs, but we can't complain if we've never tried to understand their challenges and concerns as well. So in summary, I think you'll be better at what you do and be better to work with when you don't completely silo yourself and have some perspective and context of those around you, which goes beyond work as well. We want to avoid an us versus them mentality. So maybe take a short course on a topic outside your area of expertise and see if you can form feature teams with a mixture of disciplines instead of keeping them separate. In open source, a novice attempt at a PR is much more welcome than just throwing issues over the fence. So maybe you can foster that attitude at work as well. Now, onto the codey bits. I firstly want to say that I generally prefer keeping my Vue app and my Laravel API in the same Git repository. This doesn't mean they have to be deployed to the same server. You can still host your PHP code and your static code in the most optimal places. And I still think this can be valuable even if you have entirely separate teams handling these things, which I'm not a huge fan of due to the siloing I mentioned in my previous point, but also because the coordination can be slow and error prone. I've worked on decent sized applications using mono repos and split repos and find that ultimately the front end is always going to be pretty tightly coupled to the back end. And what inevitably happens is that you need to create PRs in both repos that depend on each other and that need to be deployed together. And this is just so much easier with a mono repo. And if you haven't heard about the code owners file, it's a feature of GitHub and GitLab that lets you specify users or groups that are responsible for different parts of the codebase. You can create rules so that PRs require a code owner review before merging. So you could use this, for example, to guard your Tailwind config from devs sneaking in one-off values that don't belong in the design system. So after you've set up your monorepo, the next thing I think you should do is to read the Vue style guide at least once. It's full of useful nuggets of information and provides a bunch of great guidelines, so you don't have to come up with your own. If you like it, they have an official ESLint plugin to enforce it so that you don't need to think about it. Now, whether you're working for an organization with a dedicated design team or you're just solo, a component library, which is basically just a collection of reusable components, can help you move fast because it acts as a set of building blocks that you can quickly pull in rather than constantly getting sidetracked. It's a bit of upfront work, but I think it pays off. I would suggest starting with your basic form inputs and buttons as you'll be using these everywhere. I like to pull in Tailwind's first-party custom forms plugin and handle basic appearance and build up from there. You'll basically just be decorating the browser's native components with extra common functionality like loading states, error states, icons, labels, etc. Perhaps even more complex things like having text areas auto-size their height to fit the text. I would say please avoid reinventing the wheel. See how long you can get away with just wrapping and styling the standard inputs like select boxes, rather than re-implementing them with divs. It's so much work to do properly, and so many implementations miss out on a lot of specific interactions that the standard browser ones have. So if you are going to do it, know what you're getting into and make sure you do it right. To help create and maintain your component library, consider a tool like Storybook. It describes itself as a development environment for UI components. It's free and open source and installs into your app as a dev dependency, but it has its own separate build process. I've found it really helpful when developing component libraries because I can develop them in isolation from specific use cases and easily toggle the various states they need to handle without having to trigger that specific scenario in my app. It's also really helpful for organization and just showcasing what you have, which is especially useful for teams. You can lose a ton of time customizing it, so I would just start with a bare bones installation and a couple of plugins like the knobs plugin that gives you a UI for changing the props that your component receives. Now, before we get into the fun stuff, I have a few quick tips and PSAs for components that I would like to share. You may have heard the saying, move fast and break stuff, and that might be your thing. But if we don't get this stuff right, then we'll be moving slow and breaking stuff, and I don't think that's anyone's thing. So the first is that your custom form components should behave like native HTML form components. So for example, a custom text input should behave the same as a HTML text input when you use vModel or listen for any events like change, blur, etc. And there's really only two things you need to do. The first is to learn how vModel works, because it's a really important building block for components, and I want to encourage everyone to learn it. By design, props can't be modified by child components. So vModel on a child component is basically just shorthand or syntactic sugar for passing it a prop and listening for an event to tell the parent to update it. Inside our component, we can't use vModel on the underlying input because it will modify the prop. So instead, we pass it the vModel value and emit the vModel event when it changes. This works a little bit differently between Vue 2 and 3, and it's all covered in the docs. So the point is to make sure you're aware rather than to teach specifics. Vue 2 can only have one vModel, but there is an alternative prop modifier called sync that basically does the same thing for other props. But in Vue 3, we can have multiple vModels by passing an extra argument to specify a different prop instead of the default model value prop. The only other thing you need to do is proxy any attributes and events to and from the underlying input element. You don't want to layer on lots of extra features, but then block all of the standard stuff from working. This also works a little differently between Vue 2 and 3. Vue 3 gives us this variable called $attrs, which contains all of the attributes and event listeners that were bound into the component. So things like maybe the input type and the placeholder, as well as any event listeners like change or blur. In Vue 2, the class and style attributes were not included, and the listeners were in a separate variable called $listeners, along with a few little caveats which were improved in Vue 3. And again, this is covered in the docs. But by binding this to the underlying input, we don't need to add props for every possible HTML attribute, nor listen for and re-emit every possible HTML event. We can use object destructuring to pass these into our underlying input while ensuring we have everything we need to make vModel work. And you may have noticed inherit attrs at the bottom. This tells Vue not to automatically add the attrs to the root element in your component as well. So we talked a bit about props, but we shouldn't forget slots, which give us a great way to make more composable components because they accept HTML and other components. I would encourage you to consider slots before props for your component APIs where it makes sense, and we're going to go over a really cool example shortly. I'd also encourage you to keep your components as generic as possible so they are more composable. Think of it like a burger. If you put the sauce inside the patty, then it's hard to change the sauce. And if you don't want pickles, then you don't have to have them. But please give them to me because they are my favorite. I also wanted to mention a few common mistakes I see with HTML elements and remind everyone to select HTML elements based on their behavior rather than their default appearance to improve accessibility and user expectations. So please make sure you're using an anchor tag or router link when you're linking to something, even when you don't want it to look like a link. This is better for usability and accessibility because it links the web together in the way it was intended. And it allows things like right-clicking to open in a new tab, which you can't do with a click event. We can use binding if we need dynamic values, and we don't need to worry about manually adding interactive cues like the pointer cursor because the browser gives us all of that for free. Likewise, if clicking on something triggers some sort of behavior, then it should probably be using a button tag. This includes things like the little user avatar menu at the top right that opens a menu, or inside the heading of a table to change the sort direction. Speaking of those user menus, it's not unusual for those to contain a mixture of links and buttons, even though they all look the same. So you need to make sure your components are flexible enough. And once again, the button element gives us a bunch of extra stuff for free. It's tabbable, focusable, it has the right cursor, it can be pressed with the spacebar, and it communicates its intent to assistive technology without needing extra ARIA attributes. You don't want to have to re-implement all of that on a div. If you do add a click handler to something unconventional like a table row, make sure you have an accessible fallback. Make sure you can tab through your application without the mouse and still access all features, and make sure you can always tell what element has focus. Now, it's really common to not use a HTML form element for our forms because we don't need to when we're submitting our data via JavaScript, but we still benefit from using one. The main reason for me is that it automatically lets users press the Enter key to submit the form, which is especially useful on a login form or search field. We just need to prevent the browser from handling the event itself. And once again, we're using what the browser gives us for free, and we're adhering to existing expectations of how the web works. In a similar vein, even though we don't need a name on our form inputs to post data, it's still useful context for password managers and browser auto-completion. And this is easy to forget when you're not actually using your product for real and just entering dummy data each time. You might even consider explicitly adding a name prop to your custom input component so that you can make it required. One area where I think we can benefit from changing the native behavior is with buttons. By default, if you don't specify a type, then you get a submit button instead of a button button. I guess originally on the web, most buttons were submitting forms. But these days, I find more buttons are doing things other than submitting forms. You can do this in your button components by explicitly adding a prop for the type with a default of button. Now you'll only need to explicitly specify the type when you deliberately want it to submit a form. All right, now onto some fun component examples. The first one I'd like to talk about is a data table component because I can demonstrate a few different techniques with it. The point isn't necessarily to teach you specifics, but more to inspire different component APIs. But if you are interested in specifics, I'll be sharing a repo on Twitter with this component, so don't worry about trying to capture it all. Now, the tricky thing with table components is that depending on how much data you're dealing with, sometimes you might have all of the data in memory on the front end and manage sorting, filtering, and pagination there. And other times you might make an API call for each of those, even in the same app. There are a few libraries out there for handling this sort of stuff, but they always seem to do both more than you want and less than you want at the same time. So I'm a fan of creating my own simple generic components that I can piece together as needed. And a quick note on libraries. When you do need them, try to find headless libraries that put you in complete control of what's actually rendered, especially when you're implementing a custom design. So this is the initial component API we'll be looking at. We've got our column definition where we're giving each column a name and a label, and then we're passing in our row data where the keys match the names in the column definition. And here's the initial implementation inside the component. We're looping over the rows to output the TR tags, and inside that, we're looping over the columns to output the TD tags with the value inside. And this is fine when our row data is exactly what we want to show. But Steve Shoger and Adam Wathan showed us that our tables could look more like this, with pictures and multiple pieces of data in the same column and other UI elements that require extra markup. So how can we do this nicely without adding HTML to our data and potentially exposing ourselves to a cross-site scripting vulnerability? One way is to use scoped slots with dynamic names. So back to our component API. Let's first remove our occupation column because we're going to display that underneath the person's name in our full name column. This will mean we won't be able to sort by occupation, so always keep that in mind. Now let's add a column to the end for our row actions, like our edit button. This doesn't exist in our row data, but that's okay. I've left the label blank because these columns typically don't have a heading. Now, let's extract all of this from the template to give ourselves some room. That's better. And now let's see what it could look like to specify templates for specific columns. Here's our dynamic slot naming convention, which is column, dash, and then their column name. So in this example, we've got column-full name, column-status, and column-actions. We only need to provide a template for columns where we aren't happy with the default and want to customize it. We're using scoped slots because we need access to the data for the specific row we're outputting. And we can make available whatever we want here, like the individual value of the cell that would have been output if we weren't customizing it, along with the data for the entire row, so we can have columns that display multiple pieces of information. It's then a matter of adding whatever markup we want to use when rendering that column, referencing whatever data we need, like the example here. Remember that we only need to add templates for columns that we want to customize. And likewise, we can even create columns for things that don't exist in the data, like our actions column, where we will need to provide a template because there is no default. And because we're using slots, we can even pass in other components like the user avatar example here. As for how this works, if we look at our original implementation where we loop over the rows and then loop over the columns, all we need to do is wrap our existing cell content in a slot so that the original cell content now becomes the default content for the slot. Then we give it a dynamic name using our naming convention, and then pass in any data that we want to be in scope for the injected template. One extra thing to consider is that you could even put one slot outside the TD and another inside so that you could choose at what point you wanted to inject your custom template in case you really wanted to change the TD. Personally, I haven't felt the need, as generally all I need to do is change the text alignment, and for that I like to add an extra alignment property to my column definition so that it applies automatically to the heading and the cell. You can also add slots for your headings as well, using a naming convention like heading-column name, and then pass the label as the slot props and the default slot content. This could be handy if you wanted to use an SVG icon instead of text. I also typically wrap it in a button element so the heading is clickable to change the sorting. We're just emitting a sort event, which we can listen for in the parent and then do whatever is required to sort the data. I put this button outside of the slot so that it doesn't need to be re-implemented by anyone providing a custom template. And in reality, I'd also add a sort icon outside the slot that shows the active sort column and the direction it's sorting. And because not every column should be sortable, I add a property called sortable to my column definitions to specify whether or not the button and icon are rendered. And I've implemented all of this in the example repo that I'll be sharing. So our final column definition might look like this, with the extra sortable and align properties. If your column is rendering multiple pieces of information, like our example, then you'll want to name the column after the data that the sort will apply to, because that's what we're emitting in our sort event. For example, if you have a separate first name and last name field in your data, but want to display them in the same column, you probably want to sort by the last name. So I would use last name as my column name and name as the label. As I mentioned earlier, some tables will want to sort, filter, and paginate client-side, while others will need to make an API request for each of those. The table component itself is just concerned with rendering the table and not with fetching, sorting, filtering, or even pagination. But you could create another more opinionated wrapper component that adds some of those features if you wanted. And you may have noticed I've snuck in an extra prop and event to our component API. The table component itself isn't handling the sorting, but we still need to tell it what column and direction it's sorting by so that it can display the appropriate sort icon and emit an event when the user wants to change it. We can get away with just sort column on its own and not sort direction if we use the JSON API convention of placing a minus sign in front of the column name when it's descending, which is also implemented by Spartsy's Query Builder, so we can pass it straight to Laravel if we're using that. As for how I like to handle that, when the data table component emits a sort event, the page component uses Vue router to store the related state in the URL rather than in the component. This lets us refresh the page, share the link, and so on. We then have a computed property that makes it easy to access. I would recommend building separate components for pagination and filtering and doing a similar thing for those as well. For the pagination component, I would try to use a router link component rather than programmatically changing the URL for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Also notice that I'm using router.replace rather than router.push. This makes it so that the back button doesn't take you through every sort iteration before going back to the previous page. For pagination though, I would want to keep each page in the history. On to the next challenge. Having an icon component can make working with SVG icons in your project a lot nicer. You can use them directly, but also incorporate them into other components like your input component with an icon prop to put a little icon inside for things like email addresses and passwords. For buttons, I tend to just pass them directly in via the slot, but you may like to create an icon prop here too. And if you're wondering about the base part in the name, check out the Vue style guide. So there's a few ways to include SVG icons. You can reference them with an image tag, but then you can't change the color or stroke width with utility classes. You can paste them in line, but then you no longer have a central place to manage your icon files, and every time you use the same icon, you're increasing your bundle size. Or you can convert them to individual Vue components, but that's a pain, and you can't use them in places like email, so you need to maintain multiple versions. Or we can create a component that looks like this, that solves all of our problems. And this is how it works. This is the Vue 2 version because Vue 3 and the Webpack loader I'm using are still in beta and require a little extra finessing at the moment, but I'll be sharing a link to my Vue 3 implementation at the end. So our template here just contains a dynamic component, and we will tell it what to render via this isIconComponent part. This means that our root component will be an SVG and it won't be wrapped inside a div. I'm also applying a few styles and classes that allow me to size and color the icon using Tailwind's text utility classes. We've then just got a prop for the icon name. Everything else we'll configure with CSS utilities. And here is the computed property that tells our dynamic component what to be. I'm using this third-party Webpack loader called Vue SVG Loader to dynamically create a Vue component from the SVG icon and return the component definition. You can keep your icons centrally organized and still in their rightful SVG format. And I'm using code splitting so that it only downloads each icon as needed, rather than including them all in the main bundle. The syntax before the file name is the inline Webpack loader syntax that tells Webpack to ignore any existing loaders configured for this file type and instead use this specific one. So you don't need to configure this loader globally if you don't want to. And you may notice that we're calling the name prop at the start and not doing anything with the value. This is a bit of a hack to make sure that we call the props getter inside our computed property and not just in the anonymous function that we're returning. This will trigger Vue to register the name as a dependency for this computed property and to recompute it if the name changes. Now our last component is a completely different example that implements behavior rather than visual elements. This one is pretty niche and the accessibility and UX of it are pretty questionable. But the goal is to make horizontal scrolling easier for mouse users by translating vertical scrolling into horizontal movement. So when I scroll this vertically with my mouse wheel, the content scrolls horizontally. And when I use two-finger scrolling on my trackpad, both horizontal and vertical scrolling translates to just horizontal scrolling. Computers in general are optimized for vertical scrolling, so I would try to avoid horizontal scrolling in the first place if possible. And any sort of click or scroll hijacking makes me feel bad because it messes with people's expectations and control of their machine. But in the scenario I built this for, my expectation was that it would scroll like this. So just be super critical if you do find yourself on a similar path. And keep in mind that in this case, if the page this was on had vertical scrolling and your mouse happened to fall over one of these while scrolling, it would instantly trap it and start scrolling sideways instead. You could probably make that nicer with a delay or something, but that's not the point of this. I'm not trying to teach you how to implement horizontal scrolling, but just to demonstrate an approach of extracting generic functionality. Two things to note are the lack of horizontal scroll bars and the way that it automatically scrolls back to the active item on mouse leave. Now this component doesn't have anything to say about appearance. It just wraps whatever content is passed in with those few classes to get it working. I mentioned the hidden scroll bars earlier. That isn't even implemented in this component because that's an extra opinion. It's a utility class that I can apply from the outside in the cases where it's wanted. And here's the logic for the scrolling. On mount, we're binding an event listener to our container div to intercept the scroll wheel event. Because this is bound to an element in our component, we don't need to worry about unbinding it on destroy, but always keep that in mind. And I'm not even 100% sure what all this maths is doing anymore, and it was probably something I copy-pasted from Stack Overflow, so it's one of those few cases where code comments are actually useful. But basically, it's translating the horizontal and vertical scrolling input into just horizontal movement. This component also doesn't implement that behavior of centering the active item on mouse leave, because that's specific to the content being passed in and not something this component is concerned with. This component isn't even aware that there is an active item. You could, of course, implement that functionality in another more opinionated component that uses this component as a building block. Anyway, enough about components. I have a few quick backend tips today. I like to think of my controller tests as a contract between the front end and the back end, or that it's the test's job to stand in for the front end and look after its best interests. So I make them as close as possible to the real thing, so that if something changes in a way that will impact the front end, that the tests will have their back. This includes things like not using named routes in your API tests, because while these are great for server-rendered apps, they aren't something that your SPA ordinarily has access to. And also try to avoid using the without middleware method. Your middleware will be there in production, so you should ideally test with it enabled. I'd also recommend learning a bit about HTTP headers. I think we're all pretty good with using the appropriate status codes, but there are other things we can take advantage of to describe our requests and responses. For example, if you've got a resource that can be accessed in multiple formats, consider using the accept header on your request instead of creating separate endpoints. Don't think of the accept header as that annoying thing you need to add in Postman for some APIs to return JSON. If you have a resource that you normally deal with in JSON, but can also export to PDF, then just set Laravel up to provide a PDF when the request tells you that's what it will accept. Laravel's request already comes with a wants.json helper, so I like to add my own complementary helpers via macros, which look like this. There isn't much to them, we're just checking whether the accept header contains the string we're looking for. But the controller reads much nicer and has symmetry with Laravel's method when this little bit of logic is extracted. Now we're on the home stretch. I'd just like to quickly cram in as many little tips as I can for you. I could probably do an entire talk on state management, but to be honest, it's not something I think about too much these days. All I really want to say here is that I prefer local state by default. So if a page requires data just for itself, I let the page component manage it, even if it might mean a bit of duplication. It keeps my global state simpler and gives me more confidence that I'm not going to have to refactor a bunch of other components if I want to change this one. But where Vuex shines is for data that needs to be shared between multiple pages, such as the current user object. And just a quick note on form validation. You always need server-side validation to prevent bad data. Client-side validation is optional though, and can improve the user experience. But honestly, I believe server-side alone is fine for UX in most cases. When you submit a form, as long as you have a loading state so that the user knows something is happening, I think a small delay before showing validation errors is perfectly acceptable. Maybe just consider instant client-side validation for things that might fail validation even if the user enters data that is correct to them, such as a unique username checker, which still requires the backend, or a password complexity validator. Laravel has an amazing validator that's easily extendable, so I just set things up to pass that straight into my components, which generally looks a little something like this. There's not much to say really. This just passes the error message from Laravel for the specific field straight into the component for it to render. Now, something I learned from Tailwind is how much easier software is to maintain when your related concerns are in the same file and only generic code is shared and global. Now, when I think about separation of concerns, I don't think about keeping all of my CSS in one place and all of my HTML in another. I think about keeping all of the inherently coupled code together, which avoids leaky abstractions and gives me more confidence when making changes or deleting things. I've applied this to other areas like API requests. As I mentioned before, if a page component needs specific data, I let it handle it rather than trying to create a generic abstraction. They always end up having little ways that they need to differ, and you end up worrying when changing them because of what else might be depending on it. And even if you have tests, this doesn't protect you from potentially having to update a bunch of other components that aren't part of your feature, which makes your PRs big and unfocused and hard to review. I try to only share things that are inherently global or completely generic, like maybe a sorting function. I'd also like to remind you that your APIs are user interfaces for developers, not just computers, so please consider the developer experience. It's why we like things like Laravel so much, so try to carry that same care into your own code. And when I say APIs, I'm not just referring to your REST APIs. This also includes things like the props and events of a component, the public methods on a class, as well as the method arguments, and even the naming of your tests. Also, please don't forget the back button. In early SPA implementations, you could click around an app for hours and then press the back button and be sent back to the last full page load. SPA routers like Vue Router have solved that problem for us, but we still need to keep it in mind when we're getting tricky with things like modals and pagination. If you're changing the content on a page via state, consider what users might expect when they press the back or refresh buttons or share or bookmark the URL, and then see whether you can get the router involved, either via separate routes or even just query parameters like the table sorting example earlier. And check out my previous talk for a neat trick using router guards to close modal windows when you press the back button. Now, I think many of us have come around to utility CSS, but for those that haven't tried it yet, please give it a go. Tailwind is the biggest quality of life improvement I can think of since discovering Laravel, and I even used it to style these slides. Also, please don't lose sight of why you're building an SPA. The main reason to build an SPA is to create a better user experience, to make it feel more like an app than a web page. It's a lot more work to build, and if you break the way the web works or don't implement the things that people expect a web page to have, then you're defeating the whole purpose of building it in the first place. And lastly, I'd encourage you to learn the features of all of the tools you work with and stay up to date. If you're using Axios, look at interceptors for global error handling. If you're using Vue Router, consider router guards for middleware. By understanding all of the available features of the tools you use, you'll be able to select the best tool for the job and write simpler and more idiomatic code. Oh, there actually is one more slide here. What's this? What a great tip. Just kidding. You should use whatever is best for you. I just wanted to shout out my favorite text editor that's so good I just can't seem to quit it. Its modal approach to text editing gives me a whole language for describing the changes I want to make to text. And modern Vim can do things like context-aware auto-completion and go to definition, so I'm no longer jealous of IDEs, which are great at all of that, but miss that elegant way of communicating your changes to your editor. And that's all I've got. If you'd like my opinions or would like a link to the repo where I share some of the components we talked about, I'll be sharing it on Twitter at Jess Archer Codes. And also check out the Base Code podcast that I co-host with JMac. Our current mini-series focuses on writing more streamlined code in Laravel. And speaking of Base Code, I got JMac to give us a 30% discount in the digital swag for both Base Code and the new base Laravel to help you craft less complex, more readable code. Thank you for watching.
Great. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. It's like a nice little Vue Tailwind segment hour there. That was awesome. Kind of worked well back to back. All right. Thanks a lot.